Throughout the years and decades, a country's financial situation can change drastically, going from wealthy to bankrupt in the blink of an eye. It's mind-boggling to consider that some nations facing hardship today were once thriving and prosperous. Now, get ready to be shocked by these 10 countries because it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that these once wealthy nations are now struggling to make ends meet. 1. Thailand. Despite having a GDP per capita of roughly $6,000, Thailand has considerably lower levels of extreme poverty than the global average. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ayutthaya Kingdom, which encompassed a large portion of present-day Thailand, was wealthier than many European nations. The capital of the country was an important center for international trade and was just as big and elegant as Paris. The Ayutthaya Kingdom traded goods with traders from China, Japan, and farther off countries like France and Portugal. Once upon a time, it was all rainbows and sunshine, but then, bam, the party was over. Trade took a nosedive and the economy went into tailspin. Plus, there was always that pesky risk of getting invaded by Burma. And guess what? In 1765, the Burmese army rolled in like a wrecking ball and took down the capital. 2 years later, Ayutthaya was toast, completely destroyed. But hold your horses. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Thailand rose again as the Thonburi Kingdom. It was the modern-day Thailand, but not as strong as it used to be. 2. Mali. Among the world's poorest countries, Mali has a GDP per capita of approximately $837. Much of the populace in this drought-prone African country, which the UN lists as one of the 47 least developed states. The majority of the nation's economy relies on subsistence farming to get by. Back in the day, things were totally different. Can you believe this nation used to be the heart of the powerful Mali Empire, one of the richest and most powerful in all of Africa? Emperor Mansa Musa I was in charge from 1312 to 1337, and that's when the empire was at its absolute peak of power. Moreover, the ruler of Mali held half the world's gold reserves because of its abundance of the metal. In the middle of the Sahara Desert, Timbuktu, the capital of the empire, was a well-known center of trade, culture, and education. The Mali Empire persisted until the 16th century, but by then, its riches and power had declined tremendously. Mali's only a shell of its former self, no more the flourishing nation that it previously was. 3. Turkey. Turkey is not exactly struggling financially, but it's not rolling in dough either. The GDP per capita is around $11,000, which is lower than most of Europe. This puts Turkey in the developing market economies group. Back in the day, the Ottoman Empire, which eventually became Turkey, was killing it economically. In the 16th century, their GDP was double that of Western Europe. They were ruling over Anatolia, parts of southeastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East like bosses. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's rule, the empire grew to become a powerhouse. Because he managed a golden period of military glory, this was made achievable. As the Ottoman Empire's territorial expansion stalled in the later half of the 16th century, the colonial powers of Europe eventually overtook it in the 1700s. There were numerous internal disputes, and the empire was collapsing by the turn of the 20th century. Sadly, most of the country's lands were stolen after it backed Germany in World War I. In 1922, the Ottoman Empire came back as the far weaker Republic of Turkey, following the Turkish War of Independence. 4. India. The GDP per capita of India is a miserable $7,000. Several hundreds of millions of Indians still live in poverty, despite recent significant headway in the country's efforts to end some of the most severe kinds of poverty. India used to be a pretty happening place back in the day. The Mughal Empire, which started in 1526 and controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, was rolling in the dough in the 17th century. By the early 18th century, Mughal India had more than 25% of the world's GDP, making it a top economic powerhouse globally, even beating out China. Furthermore, leading up to the 18th century, India held the title of being the top producer globally, making up a whopping 25% of industrial output. Despite England having a high standard of living in Europe back then, the truth is the people in Mughal India were actually living better with higher real earnings and improved living conditions. It's a bummer, but the empire fell apart due to some serious disagreements with its own people in the late 1700s. And to make matters worse, the British swooped in and took over in 1858. By that point, India's once thriving industries were completely wiped out, leaving the country in a pretty rough spot. The colonized nation also lost a lot of its wealth and power, which was a major blow. 5. Latvia. Latvia was far more prosperous than its Baltic peers when it attained independence in 1918, following several years of foreign control. In fact, Latvia's standard of life exceeded that of the Scandinavian countries, and the country's economy thrived, primarily due to strong exports of agricultural and forestry products. Sadly, the period of extraordinary luxury was very brief. During the Second World War, both the Soviet Union and the Nazis wreaked havoc on Latvia, leaving the country in ruins. Eventually, the Red Army emerged victorious and took control of the nation. In 1944, Latvia became a satellite state of the Soviet Union, remaining under its rule until 1990, when the Soviet Union's collapse led to the destruction of the nation's economy. Since regaining its independence in 1990, Latvia has made significant strides in rebuilding its economy. Despite joining the EU, the country still faces challenges, with a GDP per capita of around 14 grand. This places Latvia behind the Scandinavian countries it once outperformed. However, the nation continues to work towards economic growth and prosperity. 6. Cuba. Cuba has faced significant challenges due to harsh U.S. sanctions and years of communist rule. With a GDP per capita of just $7,815, the island struggles to provide for its people's basic needs. Back before Fidel Castro took over in 1959, Cuba was thriving. It had one of the highest GDPs per capita in the Americas, along with high rates of telephone and vehicle ownership and a booming tourism and sugar industry. It was basically a paradise for wealthy Americans. However, things took a turn after the revolution, with a sharp decline in GDP per capita. When Soviet subsidies ended in the early 90s, the economy crashed and has yet to recover. The current GDP per capita is still lower than it was back in the 1950s. 7. Iraq. Iraq quickly advanced in order to produce a highly developed nation in the 1960s and 70s. Rich in natural gas and oil reserves, the Middle Eastern country benefited immensely from the 1973 oil crisis spike in oil prices. The standard of living in Iraq was among the best in the whole region. The GDP per capita had grown significantly since the 1950s, more than tripling in the 1970s, and the country is known for its outstanding infrastructure, healthcare systems, and social welfare programs. When Saddam Hussein officially took control in 1979, it was like the start of a downward spiral for Iraq. The economy got wrecked by a brutal 8-year war with Iran, and things only got worse with corruption and falling oil prices. Sanctions were slapped on the country left and right, and by the end of the decade, the GDP per person had tanked to a measly $938. 8. Zimbabwe. Since the turn of the millennium, Zimbabwe has been through a roller coaster of financial disasters, going from a thriving breadbasket of Africa to the continent's worst economy. Back in the 1980s, Zimbabwe was riding high on its natural resources and successful agricultural industry. But things took a turn for the worse in the 1990s. President Mugabe's administration made a disastrous decision in 2000 to seize highly productive white-owned farms, leading to a sharp decline in productivity and a major blow to the economy. The economic crisis in Zimbabwe was exacerbated by rampant corruption and skyrocketing inflation. By 2003, a staggering 95% of the population was without a job. Unfortunately, not many improvements have been seen since then. It looks like Zimbabweans will continue to face tough times for the foreseeable future. 9. Nauru. Back in the 1970s, the tiny island of Nauru was rolling in the dough. Thanks to its bountiful phosphate reserves, crucial for making fertilizer, Nauru had the highest GDP per person in the world, almost hitting $20,000. The government wisely stashed away $1 billion in trust funds, knowing that the phosphate supply wouldn't last forever. Unfortunately, those funds were mismanaged and eventually dried up. By the 1980s, Nauru was broke after the mining industry went belly up. To make matters worse, the financial and telecom systems went kaput. Since then, Nauru's been relying on foreign aid to stay afloat. The GDP per capita has plummeted to around $8,000. Poverty's rampant and the nation's future looks pretty grim. 10. Venezuela. In just a few years, Venezuela's economy has gone from being one of the best in Latin America to one of the worst. This drastic change was mainly due to the country's heavy reliance on oil, which took a hit when oil prices plummeted in 2014. Despite enjoying the good times when oil prices were high, the government failed to diversify the economy. As a result of the government's strict pricing policies and refusal to accept outside help, Venezuela is now facing severe shortages of essential items like food and medicine. The once prosperous nation is now grappling with widespread hunger, rampant crime, and social unrest on the rise. If you found this video interesting, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to receive more content. And don't forget to share with us your thoughts in the comments section. See you in the next video.